Welcome to Is There Fudge on Mars? We have the usual list of suspects here. David Jones, Stephen Maltz. Oh, I called him Stephen. I'm being respectful. You like that?
Sir Stephen.
And myself, David Shepherd. I hope you've had a good week so far where you are. We've had snow here today in Hereford. What's it like in the darker reaches of Essex, Mr. Maltz?
Perfectly all right, just cold.
No snow?
No snow, no.
And David, in the place that no one knows how to spell, Altrincham, or is it Altrincham, or how do you say it?
Altrincham, yes, Altrincham, with a G. We've had a smattering of snow yesterday morning, but then by mid-afternoon it all petered out.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, I know it takes me a long time to edit these recordings, so it could be midsummer by the time people are listening to this, but at least they'll be able to gauge when we've done it. Anyway, enough of that. We English talk about the weather too much. What about the church instead? What is the church? What is church? What about local expressions of church? Does church need a building? There are a lot of banana skins to slip on there. David, where do we start? You'll start for 10.
Do I start with something positive or negative? That's the big question, isn't it?
Negative and build up from negative.
Build up people first, and then we'll move to the negative. Get the big picture first, I suppose.
Okay. So in the New Testament, the synagogue was a meeting place. And I think the church in Jesus' time and the disciples' time was something very similar to that. It was just a place for believers to meet together. And then within a very short period of time, they left meeting in each other's homes and meeting in caves because obviously they were being persecuted, to meeting in buildings once it became the established church of the Roman Empire, which again was probably a very negative thing to have happened to the church.
What year was that?
So many people think of it as being Constantine, who was the person who did that. But it's Theodosius, I seem to recall. Is that right, Steve? Was it Theodosius?
Never heard of him.
Never heard of him. Okay, so I think he was the first.
Thank you for that helpful comment,
yeah.
Steve.
Yes, thank you for concurring. I think it was a Roman emperor called Theodosius who basically started that off. And then it was Constantine's mother who started to uncover some of the locations.
Yeah, Helena.
Helena. Some of the locations associated with Jesus in the New Testament. Anyway, the upshot was that very quickly, within the space of a couple of hundred years, it went from probably being this very dynamic thing, very organic thing, to being institutionalized in buildings. And I think from that moment on, a lot of the ideas became diluted. Church became very formal. And I think it lost some of the fire that it had in its belly that we see being played out in the book of Acts.
Yeah, something that I was thinking about, I read it the other day, that the church mentioned in the New Testament, principally, they were just house churches initially, weren't they?
Yeah.
And, of course, the church was called the Way before it became called the church. But what do we mean by the church? You've already alluded to the fact that we started to move into buildings, and buildings often now are called a church. But what is the church?
I'll give you a negative view.
Maybe you can. Were you listening?
I was actually listening.
We were going positive first.
I was doing a very exciting doodle, but we're told. I mean, Rosie tells me to do things like this so that it can empower your creative urges.
Who's Rosie?
Rosie Smith, yeah, the legendary Rosie Smith, artist supreme of the Foundation's experience.
And
anyway, moving on.
Big friend.
The problem was, as David said, David Jonesy, that the church buildings, when they came in, they only came in for one reason, and that was control. because by that time the church was established by structures, lots of people with grand titles. It wasn't just the titles that you see in the New Testament, but more sort of, archdeacons was deacons and archbishops and all sorts of stuff. And Constantine decided that the whole Roman Empire is now Christian. Like the day before it was pagan, now it's Christian, and everyone's suddenly Christian, even though they didn't know it. They realized that they had to control people. And so they built these churches, these buildings, and the buildings were basically copies of the Roman basilicas, the legal building where they did all their law. And it's built on the same structure with someone at the front telling everyone what to do and everyone else just listening. And that's the model they used for the church buildings from that point onwards. And the whole point of it was that when people came into the buildings, they were meant to be pliable. They were meant to be just sit down and shut up and listen to the bishop or the priest at the front, and everything he says, just to follow. No one could read the Bible. The Bible wasn't in anyone's language. It was in Latin, and no one had Latin Bibles anyway, apart from the priests and the bishops. So it was totally about control. That whole system with the buildings was all about controlling the people, and even through superstition by saying that they're not saved unless they're in the building. Outside the building, they're not saved only by coming to church and doing all the things they're supposed to do. It's the only way they're going to get to heaven. Well, that's not church. That's the thing. The church is the true understanding of church is the word ecclesia, the Greek word ecclesia, which meant the called out ones. We are the church. It's people, not buildings. The building thing came in to control people, but it's the people that were the church and still are.
You've just said, Steve, that the church is the ecclesia. You said it means the called out ones. I read somewhere that another meaning for ecclesia is the congregation, a grouping of people. And it was used not just for Christians, but for people generally when they came together.
Yeah, I think when they came to translate the Bible into English, I think it's Wycliffe or Tyndale, when they saw that word, there was pressure. I think Tyndale, what he wanted to do was to translate the word ecclesia and have it as congregation. But the powers that be didn't want it because they wanted to make sure people were herded into the buildings. So they rejected that particular translation and made sure that the word church always meant the building in which they met. And we're still there, really. To the outside world, that people don't realise that many churches meet in homes or even leisure centres or whatever. People still see those crumbly old buildings and the crumbly old people inside and think that's Christianity.
It's common, isn't it, to say, which church do you go to? Oh, I go to St. Peter's or St. Matthew's or St. Mark's. And they are usually talking about the building. Whereas you can't go to a church, you are church. Would that be a good way of putting it? Or we are church?
It's the terminology has come down through the ages and we can't break out of it. It's so sad. What can we do?
There's a lot of people, though, nowadays who and it seems to be a very common thing, that a lot of people have withdrawn from going to, and I'm going to do inverted commas here, the church or church. How does that stack up with Scripture? Because there is a verse, I think it's in Hebrews, where it says that do not neglect the meeting together of the brethren, for thereby you create a shipwreck of your faith, something like that.
Yeah, that was the justification during the COVID times where people were meeting on Zoom, and a lot of people were rebelling against that and ignoring what they were told and meeting physically by quoting that verse and saying, Zoom isn't real to them, and I think that is so wrong because we're meeting. I mean, are we not real? We're not meeting physically, but I don't think there's any difference to whether we meet together physically or whether we're meeting virtually. we're still coming up with, we're still having the same degree of fellowship. But for some people, it was an excuse not to meet over Zoom. It's like it's an old paradigm. There was a paradigm shift when COVID came. It made people realise there was more of a positive expression they could get and more of an enriching of their spiritual life by using technology, because you can now meet people from all over the world and fellowship with them, which you could never have done before. You're stuck geographically normally, and I just think, just our foundation group, when we meet together as a team, we're literally at the four points of the compass, and we perhaps meet once a year physically, if that. But we can meet up at any time. Just press a button and there you are. And that is church.
That is doing church, basically, when people are meeting together through whatever means, whatever media, whether it's physically in a building, it's in a coffee shop, or it's on Zoom or Teams or something like that.
People, and this can be a problem, because the thing that's come down to us is the idea of the local church as the only valid expression. You tithe to your local church. You join, you're on the membership register. It's always the sense of like a social club, a local social club.
Yeah.
And sometimes when you don't, you're meeting people where you've got absolutely nothing in common with. Sometimes I have made very few friends through local church. Very few. Most of my friends now, like yourselves, believe it or not.
He's so generous, David, isn't he? So generous. He reluctantly admitted that we are his friends.
But yeah, just think, if we didn't have Zoom, if we didn't have virtual, this couldn't happen. Loads of what we do couldn't happen.
Yeah.
And we'd all be stuck with that in our local expression and never know of each other, because, like I said, Mr. Shepherd and I'm going to say something nice about him, is that when we first met all those years ago, we clicked right from the start. And there was something there that we never would have met each other. Or we could have met at that one conference, but we wouldn't have sustained our relationship because geographically we're too far away.
Yeah, that's true.
But our relationship, and with Mr. Jones as well, has been allowed to develop because of technology. So, technology has its places, and it is a valid expression of church.
Do you think people are missing out then? I get the impression from what you've just said that people are missing out on, again, inverted commas, real relationship and fellowship by just going to a church building.
Yeah.
I think it was David Watson who once talked about people going to church buildings and saying that they were like, I think it was snooker balls or billiard balls that kind of knock into each other and then go back into their holes.
I think so. I just don't find it a natural environment personally. Local churches, sometimes it's fine. And also churches have, now when you define church at the beginning, it's a group of Christians meeting together. Now, what we find in our local churches is how many of them are actually Christians. We don't know. They say, we keep our doors open for other people to come in, and that's fine. But it basically means that if there's anything to happen in that building, it's not just those who are of faith, but you've got to cater for those who are not of faith. So it's very hard to be, if you see what I mean, if the sermon, how does he pitch a sermon? He doesn't know, if it's too high a level, it's great for those who are believers, but what about the rest of them?
Yeah.
So going back to the New Testament, the church wasn't a place where evangelism happened. The evangelism happened in the town centres and the synagogues. And when they went out and about, that's when they met up and made converts. Then once the converts were converted, let's say, then they met together in their houses and became church. And then in Acts 2, it said, the miracles and the singing and the praying. You couldn't sort of do that in the mixed assembly. That has to be a meeting of the church. So we got away from that a bit, I think.
Okay. Let me go on a slightly different tack, and I think we'll sort of try and hit as many little points as we can. David, what about something I think that has only really happened this century, or maybe late in the last century. These mega churches, what do you think of these? I mean, in America, they have churches which are 5,000-10,000 strong.
I think both the mega churches and the more sort of smaller local churches, but probably more used to in the UK, have both got something to offer. So I think they've got positives and negatives. So Joe and I visited this huge church in Atlanta in the United States, which was, well, we really enjoyed it. We actually thought it was a great church. Now, maybe if we'd been going every week, we might have seen something different. But our experience on that one particular Sunday when we went was very positive. And we met some lovely believers, all of whom were American. And we had a chat with a worship leader that we'd specifically gone to see, strangely enough, called Laura Story. It's called the Perimeter Church in Atlanta. And we had a lovely chat with Laura after the service. It had its own bookshop because it was such a big church. I mean, I'm talking like a bookshop the size of a small Waterstones. So it was a very interesting place to visit.
I bet they didn't have Steve's books in, though, did they?
No, do you know they didn't? No. Well, maybe they'd run out. They're all bestsellers. So
yeah, that's right, probably.
And then back home in the UK, I've had some very, very positive experiences of local churches, but also some extremely, and we've spoken about this before, some extremely negative experiences as well. So I'm trying to think how to answer your question and answer as honestly as I can, David. My heart tells me that we shouldn't just throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Right.
And that also applies, although I've got some very grave misgivings about it, that definitely applies to even some of the larger churches, the mega churches. I think they've got their own peculiar problems. And I think the way they were advertised, particularly in the sort of late 80s, 90s, beginning of the noughties, was around this idea of a seeker-friendly church, which Steve just touched on. And this idea that what you should be doing is almost appealing to the lowest common denominator, i.e. somebody who's never been to church before, who has rarely been, maybe has only been to, baptisms and weddings and those kind of things. And suddenly you're trying to appeal to them. So it's a difficult one. I've had two experiences of church which have been very positive. One was actually my local Catholic church, which may surprise some people. And one was the Baptist church, where I went for many years over in Liverpool.
Yeah.
And that was a very, very rewarding experience. The fellowship was very warm-hearted, very loving, and also, I would say, very biblical as well. But most of my experiences have been absolutely abject and extremely concerning.
I'm just laughing because that's pretty positive to totally abject.
Yeah.
That's sad, though, isn't it? It really is sad.
It's an awful state of affairs, really.
It is, isn't it? What makes it so bad? I mean, one of the things that struck me is if you're in a mega church, how on earth do you really get to know people? One thing that has happened, and I suppose it happened, was it in the late 60s, 70s, that house churches started, so people were meeting in houses, but then home groups started in normal churches, so people were having fellowship in home groups on a weekly basis. How does that happen? Does that happen in mega churches?
Yeah, it does, because they have what, I don't know whether they still call it this, but they started off calling them cells, if I remember correctly.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
So, you would all have a cell that you were, it's a strange name, isn't it? But that you were attached to.
Yeah.
I guess cell with the idea of the body of Christ. And so you would get to know maybe 15 or 20 people really well.
The cell would be the church, not the mega bit.
Yeah.
The mega bit wouldn't.
Yeah.
That's just an assembly of, don't know, whatever, a conference. I'll tell you, I had an interesting experience a couple of weeks ago. And when you're someone like myself who goes around and speaks at places, sometimes you go to a place and you don't know anyone. And I went to a place in Southampton, and there's about 20, 25 people there. And I half knew one person. I didn't know anyone there. But within 5 minutes, it was almost like I've known them the whole of my life. because everyone there was a believer. They were all singing from the same hymn sheet. You mean that they were there because they knew I was speaking and they knew what I was going to speak about, and they were on my side, let's say. And it was just a wonderful experience. And you just actually felt you could trust these people and that you could sort of speak to them as if they'd been old trusty friends, because we have a common language. That's the beauty of being a believer who may be mature in their faith. You can start a conversation with someone and you don't have to give background. You know, you got an immediate point of contact with them. And the sense for me was how the Holy Spirit knit us together. And for that moment, for those few hours I was there, we were church. You know, it was no other definition. You don't have to, a church doesn't have to be a place where you're in a local environment or you're a member or this, that, or the other. It was just 20 people from wherever. They sort of knew each other. They didn't know me. But by the end of the day, we were like old friends. And I think that's the unique beauty of true church. And, you know, it should always be like that, I think. You know, and perhaps it will be one day when we're forced underground, you know, as people keep saying, when the times get tough. But and you know that everyone is authentic, because you can go in the church and not everyone is of the church. You know, some might speak the language, and I remember someone saying, you know, that statistically maybe only 25% people in the church are actually believers. The rest are there because it's a nice social gathering and they feel safe, or they're still searching, or whatever. But to be in a place with like-minded believers, strive for that, and you can get that online. And an example that we had, I'm not sure if you both were part of it, but when we did our COVID conferences, which were totally online, you know, using Zoom, we, on the first one, which was Foundation 17 or 16, can't remember that, the response we had afterwards with people, the way that they were affected by that weekend conference, or was it a few days? I can't remember. But we had more feedback from that than any other conference we've ever done.
Yeah, yeah.
They felt the Zoom environment gave them a closeness to each other that they've rarely experienced in real life. It was strange, and that was real true church.
That's interesting.
You know. So maybe I'm a maverick, maybe that's just me, but big churches don't do it for me at all.
I must admit that there are people that I've met who, I suppose theologically, they'd be very different to me, but I've clicked with them. And I don't know if you've had that experience. You meet somebody for the first time, you've only known them for about, 20 seconds or so, and you kind of go, yes, there's something there. Even if you know that they've got different views on various things, there are differences between you, you still have that connection, which is basically you're all part of that body, the body of Christ, and you're joined together in Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. So what's the fate of the church at the moment? I mean, you talked about maybe the church going underground, Steve, which is certainly a possibility if there's persecution for the church.
This group I met, I won't mention their names because they got into trouble when they had their meetings more public, and they videoed the meetings, and the videos got out and people actually took exception to what they were saying, and they got fined by some authority. So they've actually gone underground. All the meetings. So that meeting I went to, when I was videoed, that video would be on a website that's password protected, number one. And everyone that they invite are, let's say, more of a maverick persuasion. But the people that they're inviting next after me were a group. They're part of a church in this country, but they're Iranian Christians.
Wow.
And they've got experience of being underground and persecuted. And they're going around the country almost like preparing Christians for what could be coming. So this group that I met, they very much think that very soon we are going to be part of an underground network, the way that our culture is going, perhaps, and this is all preparation for it. So that's possibly what's going to happen, because it's happened elsewhere. And if they pull the plug, I don't know how we're going to meet, if there's no Zoom, for instance.
Mhm.
You have to set up your own thing, Steve. Go and get out all your software skills and write something all of your
At
own.
one point, we were going to do that. David Searle and Kit were thinking about having our own server, that in one of our houses, but we've got no money, and we're too old now to figure out how to do it. But
The perception of the man in the street of the church is of the building, but it's also affected very much by the person who leads that church, the vicar, the pastor, the minister, or whatever. There's been some controversy in the newspapers recently about the Archbishop of Canterbury and the fact that he didn't expose this guy who had been abusing children over a number of years, when he could have done when he first became Archbishop. What about the whole thing of leadership in the church and the responsibilities of leadership? And how does that work? Because it seems to me that some of the best little groups almost don't have leaders.
I think that's really powerful, David, what you've just said. So for people who perhaps haven't paid as close attention as maybe we have to actually what's gone down over the last few weeks, although I think most people will be familiar with the fact that Justin Welby he's been forced to resign. I don't think he wanted to resign, but I think he's been forced to resign. So it came out today that Mohammed Al-Fayed, who is obviously been charged, well, not being charged, sorry. 290 women have now come forward.
yeah,
Really?
Thus, 290, thus far have come forward to say that they were sexually harassed.
I mean, that's a complete abuse of power, isn't it?
Of course it is, or raped by Mohammed Al-Fayed. And it might be that it's not just Harrods where some of this abuse took place. It may be places like Fulham Football Club, and so also some other places where he had, a bit like Jimmy Savile, where he had the opportunity to manipulate people and to attack vulnerable people. Now, the reason that I mention that Mohammed Al-Fayed is the person who has now been appointed as the survivor's advocate for the victims is a lady called Dame Jasvinda Sanghera. And she was initially appointed by the Church of England to carry out a review to their safeguarding procedures. She was then sacked last July, because she was saying that actually what needed to take place was that because there was an epidemic of issues within the Anglican Church, that the safeguarding lead should be a person from outside of the church, and they needed to restructure the whole thing. And on the back of that, she and her team were sacked. Now, I understand that other women, even though it's over a year since she lost her position, other women have now come forward and said, this happened to me, and other young men have come forward and said, this has happened to me. And so she's written to the Archbishop of York, Stephen Cottrell, and he has not replied to any of her correspondence, either by letter or by email. And she is actually calling for him to also stand down, and for several other leading figures within the church.
he hasn't committed the same sin as Justin Welby. Historically, this is only something that's just come up.
Allegedly, him and some of the other bishops have also been involved in covering things up, or they knew more than they're currently letting on.
Yeah, no. All I'm saying is, in general terms, the church, as we know, and we've mentioned this before, has subscribed to the woke agenda, and now it's the woke agenda that's destroying them.
Yeah,
Basically.
I wouldn't disagree with that, Steve. I think that this in some ways is the heart. Well, first of all, there's two separate things going on there, isn't there? First of all, in every major institution, I would suggest throughout the land, I mean, the Metropolitan Police Service has had the same problem with misogynistic police officers, and some absolutely horrific crimes are being carried out by individual officers.
Yeah.
So I think every major institution has got these kind of problems. I think you could sift through any organisation and you would find similar things happening under people who are meant to be protecting people. So that's the first thing to say. And we need, we need to have a transparent society so that people who are victims or survivors, however you want to phrase it, feel they are going to be listened to and that they'll come forward and report these notorious activities.
I tell you why I said what I've said is because you've got the world and then you've got the church.
Yeah,
The church is meant to be different from the world. That's the whole point.
absolutely.
So if the church is following the same procedures as the woke world in looking at past crimes and basically saying we cannot forgive you, therefore you must resign, as we seems to have happened with Justin Welby. Okay, 23 years ago, whenever he didn't report something in the way that he should. Now, this is a church. Surely there is forgiveness. Surely he could actually say, I know I did wrong. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. And isn't there meant to be restitution? What I'm trying to say is that we should be seen to be different in the way that we deal with stuff that's come out of the woke agenda. Now, it'd be different for the bloke who's actually doing the bloke who's died now. I know that, and that's different. He should be in prison for life. But someone like Justin Welby, I don't know. It just seems weird that someone who you think would have been God appointed would actually be sunk by something. We can look at other aspects of it, and we can get very spiritual and talk about his comments about Israel and the effects of bringing curses on yourself.
I wanted to go on to that, Steve, actually. So that was an issue. The thought I had then, though, is that part of the problem for the Church of England is being part of the establishment and being linked to the establishment, because there's an accountability there, not just within the church, but society in general says, look, this is the Church of England. Yeah. Surely he's accountable to Parliament, to other bodies as well. And now I'm not agreeing with that, because I take the point of what you said about the church should be different, but it does actually put a pressure there which wouldn't have been there otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we've said before, the church has put itself in that position by wanting to be relevant to society, by basically saying, well, we'll abide by society's rules in order to be accepted by society. But that shouldn't be, and we are in a different kingdom, So, it's almost like perhaps God is wiping his hands of things like, the Church of England. So I've always thought the denomination. I just think this could be the beginning of the end. The disestablishment of the church and the state. We're talking about a very godless government here, who would perhaps want to rid themselves of, just like Henry II, rid me of this accursed priest, I don't know if that's the right words with Thomas a Becket,
I love the fact that you could say disestablishment. We can also say disestablishmentarianism.
Can you spell it?
No, I can't, but it's such a lovely word. As a kid, I heard it several times, and I thought, what on earth does that mean? But I like the word.
I think the problem we've got in Britain, I want to touch briefly on the United States as well in response to this. But the problem we've got in the UK at the moment is, so Justin Welby is stepping down. He's being forced to step down. Now, 2 names will now be submitted at some point next year. This won't be a quick process. It's going to take maybe 6, 7, 8 months. 2 names will then be submitted to the Prime Minister, and he will then decide who is going to be the next Archbishop of Canterbury, the leader of the Anglican communion worldwide. So an atheist, Keir Starmer is an atheist, so he is now going to choose who will be the leading church authority. Now, how on what planet can that possibly be right? That is just insane.
I wish people could see my face, because my mouth dropped and my hands went over my face when you said that.
This is because traditionally no one ever thought that a non-Christian would be running our country. It was unthinkable maybe 20, 30 years ago.
Disraeli was a Jew, wasn't he?
Yeah, but he converted.
Did he? All right, there you go. And Lloyd George wasn't a Christian, was he?
He was. this is the whole point. This is the whole point, really. So many people will say in the United States, you have the separation of church and state. That's a complete and utter nonsense. People who say that, they don't know what they're talking about. Because if you look at the American Constitution, writ large within it, is everything within the American Constitution is founded on, and all presidents would acknowledge this, is founded on biblical principles. So, and now that obviously you can argue, like we have in this country, that we've moved away from that. And this is the problem in the UK. It's the same in most Western countries now. We've slipped our moorings.
Right.
We now no longer know what's up or down, right or left, right and wrong, because we've moved away from our Judeo-Christian heritage. And that includes the church institutions.
Yeah. Let's come to the point that you were making, Steve, about Israel. I know that there was a letter sent to the Archbishop of Canterbury 2-3 months ago, was it? 3 months ago?
Yeah, and I was a signatory to it.
And it was by a number of Christian leaders expressing what?
Basically, the Archbishop had made a declaration opposing the decisions of the Israeli government concerning the Gaza war, and saying that this third-party international court has proclaimed that Israel are genocidal, and basically Netanyahu's a war criminal and all that. That court is a complete farce. It has absolutely no connection to reality. Well, the thing is, the point of this letter is, why is the Archbishop taking notice of this secular, anti-Christian court rather than following biblical principles? If he was following biblical principles, he would have a very, very different view as to Israel and the way it's conducting things at the moment.
Yeah.
And he never responded to this letter.
So no response at all?
No response. It was put up very publicly on the Premier Radio website, and I spoke to Kevin Bennett, who's the CEO of Premier. I saw him today, funnily enough, and he mentioned that, and he said there was a bit of flack putting that letter up. There were people who opposed it, which you would expect, because it was defending Israel. But the Archbishop, in my book, and there's plenty of precedent for this, that those who curse Israel will bring curses on themselves, and he didn't last very long after that. I'd say there is a connection.
If I was a member of a Church of England church at the moment, which I'm not, and I've grew up in the Church of England, and I have lots of affection for my time there, and I certainly enjoyed a lot of the services and the liturgy and the fellowship that I had. What we guys have been talking about today would seem to them very radical and something that perhaps doesn't tie in with their own experiences of their church. What do you say to that?
I think if you lose sight of orthodoxy and the basic tenets of the faith, then you are going to have problems. You are going to see things that are actually the ABCs of Christianity as something that's revolutionary.
Yeah.
I think we've seen it even this week with the journalist Alison Pearson, who writes for the Daily Telegraph. And she made a comment online about a year ago about a particular group, an ideological group. And she was visited by a couple of police officers this week for just stating the absolute obvious. And I think we see that with the Church of England. So things that we think are normal are now seen as abnormal.
Right. Okay.
And just a very quick answer to Mr. Shepherd is, you should say to these people regarding the churches, who do you follow? Do you follow Jesus, or do you follow a church structure? Because they're not necessarily the same thing.
Yeah. Okay. So I'd make a distinguish between fundamentalism within the church and being radical, because radical means effectively going back to the roots.
Isn't fundamental the same thing?
Or is it? Christian fundamentalism often seems to me very extreme in all sorts of ways.
It wasn't meant to be. When the word came about, which is, I think, the beginning of the 20th century, it was a reaction to the liberal church saying, here are the fundamentals of the faith. And it was all written down in these volumes. And it was basically going back to the basics. The fundamentals, I mean, the word, isn't it? Fundamental, foundational. radical can mean someone like Rob Bell could be seen as a radical, or Tony Campolo, who just died. These are very lefty who would take a more active role in the social gospel rather than the fundamentals of the faith. They would be called radicals, I think.
Well, maybe it's just arguing over words, really. But I just kind of look at fundamentalism in the church, and my point of view, I guess, is that I see a lot of people misappropriating verses and using them in the wrong way, as Muslims have done with the Quran.
Yeah, in every religion, people will twist their holy book to go along with their own, agendas. That's human nature. We have to be above that. We have to be we have to be mature enough to basically know what God is actually saying in his word and not manipulating it according to what we want the word to say.
Oh, it's quite interesting. I've just looked up on Google the definition of radical, and it has a number of meanings, really. The first one is the meaning that I alluded to, which is arising from or going to a root or source. Number two, departing markedly from the usual or customary, extreme or drastic. And there was a third one, which says relating to or advocating fundamental or revolutionary changes in current practices, conditions, or institutions. I've got a feeling that we probably would put our names to number one, arising from or going to a root or source, and number three, relating to or advocating fundamental or revolutionary changes in current practices, conditions, or institutions.
So just read out number two again, David, because when you read it, my immediate reaction was, this is exactly what's happened to the Church of England.
Departing markedly from the usual or customary, extreme or drastic.
Yeah, I think that's what we've seen. I think, as Steve mentioned earlier, they become incredibly woke. They've wanted to, I think we've seen this with loads of churches, not just the Church of England. They've wanted to appeal so much to the world that they've forgotten that we're not meant to be of the world.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. As soon as you do that, as soon as you get involved, Steve, you guys both know how much I enjoy politics, but as soon as you start getting yourself as a Christian wrapped up in these political arguments and debates, or saying, you can only be a true Christian if you support the Palestinians, or whatever it might, or if you support, the rights of LGBT people, suddenly you will get yourself wrapped up in knots. And I think that's what's happened to Justin Welby. I think Stephen Cottrell has gone the same way, the Archbishop of York. I think John Sentiment, who people had some great hopes for, that's what happened to him. I also think, I'm sure you'd have something to say about this as well, Steve. I think once you sometimes refer to the Anglican Church as men in frocks and ladies in lavender. And I think that what happens is when those men put on those priestly garments, something happens to them. They completely change, and they get so caught up in the institution and the trappings of that institution, they forget what they're there for.
That's radical. Or is it fundamental?
It's just plain wrong.
Well, we've chewed the fat over that for quite a bit, and I think I'm not sure, did we slip on any bananas? We might have done as we were talking through
Banana skins, yeah, not bananas themselves.
Banana skins, yeah. Thank you, guys. Lots to think through there, and hopefully a lot to challenge people who've been listening, and we'd love to hear your responses.
I think this is the start of a longer discussion.
It probably is. We do not mind people disagreeing with us. That is absolutely fine. We would rather have discussion than confrontation, and we'll do that any day of the week. So thank you for listening to us. Do come and listen to us again. Is there life after Mars?
Or even fudge.
Is there life
on fudge? Is there fudge on life?
Is there fudge on Mars?
Fudge on life.
I'm going to struggle. I'm going to struggle with that title for the rest of my life. But yes, and you will also find this podcast on the Salt Shakers website, as well as on Spotify, Amazon, iTunes, etc.
Eventually.
So yes, it will get there eventually, probably in the summer.
Yeah.
So thanks for listening. Bye for now.
Bye.